in the 1990s, South Korea launched this massive national cancer screening program. They basically rolled out these highly sensitive ultrasound machines across the entire country, aiming to catch thyroid cancer early.
Right, and on paper, I mean, it looked like an absolute triumph at first. Diagnoses just skyrocketed. I think it was roughly 15-fold between 1993 and 2011.
15-fold. Thyroid cancer actually briefly became the most commonly diagnosed cancer in the whole country. But, and here is the really counterintuitive twist that sets up everything we're talking about today, catching all those extra cancers did not actually save lives.
No, it didn't. The death rate from thyroid cancer barely moved at all.
Exactly. So instead of this big public health victory, this massive influx of diagnoses triggered, well, one of the most intense ethical and psychological crises in modern medicine. And honestly, much of that crisis came down to the misunderstanding of a single ancient Greek word. So welcome to the deep dive. We have a pretty formidable stack of medical history and pathology sources in front of us today, and our mission is to decode the secret language of the doctor's office. Specifically, we're looking at two foundational Greek roots that sort of govern our entire vocabulary for disease, which are patho and carcino.
Yeah, and the reason you should care about this is that the medical system, it often feels like this walled garden. The terminology acts as a barrier, making you feel powerless when you are, frankly, at your most vulnerable.
Right. Nobody wants to feel like they need a translator for their own body.
Exactly. So our goal today is to tear down that barrier. We want it so the next time you, or maybe someone you love, are holding a biopsy report, or even just trying to parse a scary public health headline, you feel equipped to understand exactly what you are facing. We are going to trace these words from their origins as ancient metaphors through the bloodletting of the Middle Ages straight into the microscopic world of modern cellular biology.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can really understand the history of disease, we have to clear away the biggest modern misconception about what these two roots, pathology and carcinoma, actually mean in relation to each other. Because in casual conversation, people tend to throw them around as if they occupy the exact same weight class.
Oh, absolutely. But they do not occupy the same weight class at all. I mean, think of patho as the widest possible lens. It originates from the classical Greek word pathos.
Which meant something quite different back then, right?
Right. It did. In ancient times, this word was incredibly expansive. It just meant that which is experienced. So it encompassed general suffering, including emotional distress or even just intense passion.
Wow, so it's almost poetic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But as medicine formalized over the centuries, patho was strictly narrowed down to mean disease or a structural abnormality or, the systematic study of those processes.
So whether it's acting as a root in a word like pathology or a suffix in, say, neuropathy, it essentially represents the entire universe of things going wrong in the human body.
Right. It is the ultimate umbrella term for illness.
But then you encounter carcino, and the lens just violently zooms in.
Very violently. So carcino comes from the Greek word carcinos, which literally translates to crab.
Crab, like the animal.
Yes, the animal. And where patho is everything, carcino is hyper-specific. We're talking anatomically and histologically specific.
And by histologically, you mean like at the microscopic tissue level, right?
Exactly, down to the actual cells. Which brings us to a really critical distinction, probably the first massive misconception we need to correct for you listening today.
Oh, right. The fact that the word carcinoma is not just some fancy medical synonym for the word cancer.
Precisely. A lot of people use them interchangeably, but carcinoma specifically refers to cancers that arise exclusively from epithelial tissue.
So we are talking about the skin, glandular tissues, and the mucous membranes that line your organs and body cavities, right?
Right. For example, if you look at leukemias, those affect your blood-forming tissues. Lymphomas affect your immune system. Sarcomas, they attack connective tissues like bone, cartilage, and muscle.
And those are obviously all devastating cancers.
They are, but structurally speaking, they are absolutely not carcinomas.
I feel like the confusion probably happens because carcinomas make up something like 80 to 90% of all human cancer diagnoses.
Yeah, epithelial tissue is everywhere in your body. It forms the barrier to the outside world, and its cells turn over so rapidly, which just, frankly, gives them more chances to mutate.
All right, it's just a numbers game, really. But setting the biology aside for a second, I have to ask about this crab metaphor. Because whenever I hear that carcinos means crab, I immediately assume it's because cancer is stubborn. Like it has these claws that reach out, grab onto healthy tissue, and just refuse to let go.
That is a really common assumption, but our sources say that is actually completely backward from the historical origin.
Wait, really? Then where did it come from?
The reality is far more literal and, well, frankly, much more graphic. When ancient physicians like Hippocrates and later Galen were examining patients, they were observing late-stage visible tumors on the surface of the body.
Because they couldn't exactly do an MRI back then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when they looked at a hard, malignant breast tumor, for example, they saw these swollen, engorged blood vessels radiating outward from the dense central mass.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, to the naked eye, that central lump with the thick, veiny offshoots looked exactly like the round carapace of a crab with its legs splayed out into the surrounding skin.
Wow, that is a very visceral image. It explains exactly why that visual stuck in the medical imagination for so long.
It is hard to unsee once you picture it.
So if we go back to the scale of these two words, maybe an analogy might help solidify it for you. Patho, it's kind of like the concept of weather. It encompasses everything from, a gentle spring rain to a Category 5 hurricane.
I like that.
But carcino, on the other hand, is like a very specific classification of tornado that only ever touches down in one very specific type of neighborhood, which is your epithelial tissue.
What's fascinating here is the sheer durability of that specific tornado's name. I mean, Hippocrates coined that crab metaphor in the 5th century BCE.
It's over 2,000 years ago.
Right, and then hundreds of years later, the Roman encyclopedist Aulus Cornelius Celsus translated the Greek carcinos into Latin, and the Latin word for crab is cancer.
Oh, wow. So the terminology didn't just survive, it literally got translated across empires.
Yeah, it has remained essentially unchanged for over 2 millennia.
Okay, so we have the ancient metaphors locked in. But defining a disease philosophically is obviously very different from understanding its physical mechanics. Like, we really have to jump forward in time to see how the medical establishment figured out what these diseases actually were.
And that transition was agonizingly slow. I mean, for roughly 2 millennia, the brightest minds in medicine were trapped in this massive theoretical failure called humoral theory.
Right, the 4 humors.
Exactly. The prevailing belief was that the body was governed by 4 fluids, or humors, which were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile.
And disease broadly, and cancer specifically, was blamed on a systemic imbalance of those fluids, right?
Yes, they believed cancer was caused by an excess of black bile coagulating in a specific spot in the body.
Which is funny because black bile translates to melancholia in Greek, which is where we actually get the word melancholy.
That's right.
But just reading through the historical sources, it's wild to realize that humoral theory had absolutely zero empirical support. Like, nobody had ever actually isolated or identified black bile anywhere in a human body.
No, they hadn't. It didn't exist.
Yet it totally dictated treatments like bloodletting for thousands of years. It feels a bit like, I don't know, trying to fix a broken car engine by only ever checking the oil and the windshield wiper fluid because you firmly believe you just aren't allowed to open the hood.
That is a great way to put it.
So how does a totally fabricated framework like that survive for 2,000 years without anyone, calling its bluff?
Well, it survives because humans just crave order. And humoral theory offered a perfectly symmetrical, internally consistent explanation for suffering.
Even if it was wrong.
Right. When you don't possess a microscope and religious or cultural taboos prevent you from systematically cutting open the dead to see what actually killed them, a holistic theory of fluid imbalance feels incredibly logical.
Okay, that makes sense. So when did the paradigm finally shatter?
It didn't shatter until a visionary anatomist named Giovanni Battista Morgagni stepped up in 1761.
Morgagni is such a fascinating figure in these sources. The sheer volume of his work is staggering. Like, he publishes a 5-volume text at the age of 79, synthesizing roughly 700 autopsies he had conducted.
700! It's unbelievable dedication.
It really is. But how did he actually manage to dismantle humoral theory without just being ignored by the entire establishment? Because they're pretty set in their ways.
He did it through relentless, undeniable documentation. Morgagni essentially invented what we now call the clinical pathological correlation.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning when a patient was alive, he would meticulously document their specific symptoms, the exact nature of their cough, the specific location of their pain. And then when that patient died, he would conduct the autopsy and look for the physical damage.
So he was connecting the dots.
Exactly. He proved, case after case, that the living symptom perfectly matched a physical lesion on a specific organ. He demonstrated that diseases were not just these free-floating fluid imbalances.
They had actual physical seats in the architecture of the body.
Right. The disease was located in a specific place.
Okay, so Morgagni locates the disease inside the specific organ. Problem solved, right?
Not quite.
Because clearly that wasn't the end of the story. I mean, looking at a damaged lung or a liver doesn't tell you how it got damaged in the first place.
Exactly. Morgagni gave us the map, but we still needed to zoom in much further. So almost a century later, in 1858, a German physician named Rudolf Virchow pushed the boundary even further.
And Virchow is widely considered the father of modern pathology, correct?
He is.
No.
He used the relatively new compound microscope to actually look at those organ lesions that Morgagni found. And he published a book called Cellular Pathology. He argued that organs don't get sick. The individual microscopic cells that make up the organs get sick.
Oh, wow. He also coined that famous Latin dictum, right? Omnis cella e cellula, which basically means every cell arises from a pre-existing cell.
Yes, which was incredibly controversial at the time.
Why was it controversial?
Because many scientists still believed in blastema theories. That was the idea that tumors or new tissues could just spontaneously generate out of formless fluids.
Like magic.
Basically, yeah. But Virchow drove a stake through that idea. He proved you have to look at the microscopic cellular structure to actually understand pathology. His framework that all disease originates at the cellular level is essentially the operating system of modern medicine.
So Virchow proves that all disease is just cells acting abnormally. The obvious next question then is, what is actually making these normal epithelial cells mutate into carcinomas?
Right. What's pulling the trigger?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the hunt for those triggers, the carcinogens, it honestly reads like a 250-year-long detective story in our sources.
It really does. The first major breakthrough in that detective story actually came from an English surgeon named Percival Pott way back in 1775.
This is the chimney sweep story, right?
Yes. Pott noticed this incredibly rare cluster of scrotal cancer, but it was only appearing in young men who worked as chimney sweeps in London. So Pott bypassed the microscope entirely and just used pure causal reasoning. He correctly deduced that chronic daily exposure to soot lodging in the folds of the skin was directly causing the carcinoma.
That is just a staggering leap of logic for the time. I mean, before the germ theory disease, before we knew what DNA was, before the word carcinogen was even coined, he proves that substance X reliably produces cancer Y in exposed population Z.
It's amazing. And that exact epidemiological logic is still how we classify carcinogens today. But, the hunt for causes quickly moved beyond just chemical exposures like soot.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you jump to 1911. A researcher named Peyton Rouse enters the picture, and he ends up waiting half a century for the world to actually believe him.
Peyton Rouse endured one of the most frustrating careers in scientific history, no question. So in 1911, he took a sarcoma from a chicken, ground it up, and passed it through a filter so fine that it caught all the actual cells and bacteria.
Okay, so there are no cells left in this liquid.
Right. He took that cell-free liquid, injected it into healthy chickens, and watched tumors grow. He had essentially discovered a cancer-causing virus.
Wait, if Virchow just established that cancer is a disease of misbehaving cells, how did the medical community react to Rotris claiming a filtered cell-free liquid could cause it?
They laughed him out of the room.
Furiously.
Oh, yeah. The prevailing consensus was absolute. Cancer was an internal cellular malfunction. The idea that it could be infectious, transmitted by some invisible virus from the outside, that sounded like a return to the dark ages of medicine to them.
Wow, so they just dismissed him.
The establishment ignored him completely. It actually takes 55 years for the tools of molecular biology to catch up and vindicate his work. Rotris finally won the Nobel Prize in 1966 at the age of 87.
A 55-year gap. That is heartbreaking, but also incredible that he lived to see it. But that vindication opened the floodgates, right? Once we knew viruses could cause cancer, it paved the way for researchers like Harold Zerhausen in the 1980s.
Exactly. Zerhausen pursued this highly unfashionable idea that the human papillomavirus, or HPV, was causing cervical carcinoma, and he actually managed to isolate HPV DNA directly from tumor samples.
And we really cannot overstate the impact of Zerhausen's work, because once you understand the pathology, once you know a specific virus is the instigator, you don't necessarily have to cure the cancer, do you?
No, you don't. You just have to train the body's immune system to assassinate the virus before the cancer ever starts.
Which is huge. That basic pathological research led directly to the Gardasil vaccine in 2006. And we are now watching cervical cancer rates absolutely plummet in vaccinated populations. It's just a total triumph of understanding the why of a disease.
It really is one of the great success stories of modern pathology.
But stepping back and looking at the whole picture for a second, you have soot, you have visible viruses, you have radiation. By the late 20th century, the field of oncology looked like utter chaos. How could all these completely different triggers result in the exact same disease?
That is the million-dollar question. And that chaos was finally unified in the year 2000 in a landmark paper called The Hallmarks of Cancer by Douglas Hanahan and Robert Weinberg.
What do they find?
They proposed a unifying theory. They said that despite the mind-boggling diversity of cancer triggers, virtually all human cancers share a small, common set of acquired biological capabilities.
You know, reading that in the sources, it immediately made me think of a cybersecurity playbook.
Oh, how so?
Well, if you look at computer malware, there are thousands of different viruses, phishing scams, and Trojan horses that can hack your laptop, and they all look completely different on the surface. But at the end of the day, they all have to rely on a few core exploits to survive.
Right.
Like they have to shut down your firewall or drain your battery or duplicate their files to overwhelm the processor. Hanahan and Weinberg basically proved that cancer operates the exact same way.
That is a perfect parallel, honestly. The hallmarks include things like angiogenesis.
Which is why...
That's the tumor actually tricking the body into building new blood vessels just to feed it.
Wow.
Yeah. Or another one is evading apoptosis, which basically means the cell ignores the body's natural self-destruct signal. So whether the initial hack was caused by tobacco smoke, a genetic mutation, or HPV, the resulting cancer has to rely on those exact same core cellular exploits to survive and spread.
Okay, so we have mapped the origins, we have drilled down from ancient humors all the way to microscopic hallmarks.
Yeah.
But let's bring this back up to the human level. Let's return to that South Korean ultrasound crisis I mentioned at the very beginning of the show.
Yes, let's talk about that.
Because when you introduce this intense microscopic precision into the real world, the exact words we use, words like pathology and carcinoma, they start to carry massive psychological and social weight.
They really do. The South Korean crisis is the ultimate cautionary tale of overdiagnosis. The National Screening Program used incredibly sensitive ultrasounds, and they found thousands upon thousands of these tiny papillary thyroid carcinomas.
And to be clear, the pathologists looking at those biopsies under a microscope were technically correct, right?
Oh, absolutely. Histologically speaking, the cells completely met the criteria for carcinoma.
But the death rate didn't change.
It didn't change because they were dipping into a vast reservoir of indolent disease.
Indolent meaning slow growing.
Yes, these were microscopic, slow-growing cell clusters that, if left completely alone, would likely never have grown large enough to cause symptoms, let alone death.
But because the official pathology report slapped the word carcinoma on the file, it triggered absolute panic.
Right. It led to thousands of aggressive thyroid removals, patients reliant on lifelong hormone replacement therapy, and vocal cord damage. And all of this for a disease that wasn't actually threatening them.
So what does this all mean? Like, are we saying the microscope was biologically accurate, but the dictionary was actively harming the patient? Do doctors literally start deleting the word carcinoma from medical reports just to protect people from their own fear?
It sounds radical, but our sources note that some pathologists are actively proposing we rename certain low-risk lesions.
Like what?
Like specific types of ductal carcinoma in situ.
And just to clarify for you listening, in situ basically means the abnormal cells have not spread, right? They're still sitting in their original place in the milk duct.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals probably the most profound truth about the medical profession, which is that diagnosing a condition is never a neutral act.
Right, it carries baggage.
Heavy baggage. The word carcinoma implies an urgent, life-threatening crisis to the general public. If the biological behavior of those cells doesn't actually match that urgency, then the label itself becomes the pathogen. It drives overtreatment and anxiety.
That is a really intense debate to be having.
It is a fierce debate right now, and we actually see the exact same friction with the broader word pathology. Society is constantly negotiating what we consider pathological versus what we consider just a natural variation of the human experience.
The sources highlight a really stark historical example of that, with the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Yes. Until 1973, homosexuality was officially classified as a psychopathology in the DSM.
Which is wild to think about now.
It was eventually removed, but crucially, not because scientists suddenly discovered new biological data under a microscope. It was removed because of sustained social activism.
So society evolved and forced the medical establishment to realize that the label itself was being used as a weapon.
Precisely. And we see echoes of this today in the intense, ongoing debates over the disease model of addiction or obesity or even aging.
Right, like, is it a pathology requiring medical intervention or just a natural state of being? It proves that the dictionary really does define our reality, which makes it crucial that we actually understand the definitions. For example, people constantly conflate the words pathogen and carcinogen, but knowing the difference really changes how you assess risk.
It does. So a pathogen is any organism that causes disease broadly, bacteria, fungi, viruses. A carcinogen is an agent that specifically causes cancer.
But they can't overlap.
They do overlap sometimes. Like we talked about earlier, HPV is a pathogen that is also a carcinogen. But ionizing radiation from an X-ray machine, that is a carcinogen, not a pathogen.
Because radiation is not a living organism.
Exactly.
And while we're talking about the immense weight of these medical terms, and frankly, the real human lives tethered to them, we cannot ignore the story of Henrietta Lacks in these sources.
No, we can't. In 1951, she was treated for cervical carcinoma. Her tumor cells were taken during a biopsy without her knowledge or consent.
Which was unfortunately common practice then.
It was, and those cells became known as the HeLa cell line. They astonished researchers because they turned out to be the first immortal human cells ever discovered.
Immortal meaning they just kept dividing.
Right. Unlike normal cells that die after a few divisions, Henrietta Lacks's carcinoma cells could replicate indefinitely in a laboratory environment.
They have outlived her by over 70 years now.
And their impact is staggering. Descendants of that single carcinoma specimen have been utilized in tens of thousands of scientific studies. They were instrumental in testing the polio vaccine, screening countless cancer drugs, mapping the human genome.
Even conducting COVID-19 vaccine research recently, right?
Yes, even that. It is the most vivid illustration imaginable of how a single pathological specimen can fundamentally reshape the entire landscape of biomedical science. But it also serves as a permanent reminder of the deep ethical debt the medical field owes to the patients behind the biopsies.
It absolutely forces us to remember that behind every slide of epithelial tissue, there is a person waiting for answers. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for you, listening to this deep dive. We have gone from the humors of the Middle Ages all the way to immortal cell lines. But the goal was always to change how you process the medical world today.
Because knowing this vocabulary actually transforms your experience. Understanding that carcinoma is a precise, tissue-specific term for epithelial cancer and not just a universal synonym for a death sentence, that changes the temperature in the room when you read a biopsy report.
It really is the difference between paralyzing panic and actually having an informed, productive conversation with an oncologist about what specific hallmarks that tumor is exhibiting.
Exactly.
It also equips you to decode public health warnings without panicking. Like when the International Agency for Research on Cancer updates its Group 1 carcinogen list.
Which includes things like tobacco smoke, asbestos, and controversially processed meats like bacon.
Right, bacon. But you now know they're using the exact same structural logic Percival Pott used with the chimney sweeps. They are saying the data proves this agent specifically causes cancer, not just general illness. Knowing the mechanics allows you to assess the actual hazard rather than just reacting to the scary sound of the word.
Exactly. Knowledge is the antidote to the anxiety produced by medical jargon.
We want to leave you with one final thought to ponder based on a really beautiful linguistic quirk hidden deep in our source material. We talked earlier about how the root patho originally meant feeling or suffering in ancient Greece, before it splintered in the English language. One branch of that split became very cold, clinical, and microscopic, right? Words like pathology, pathogen, and idiopathic.
Right.
But the other branch of that exact same ancient root became our words for profound emotional connection. Words like sympathy, empathy, and apathy.
It is a remarkable divergence in the evolution of language.
It really is. We started this deep dive talking about how much we crave precision, how we want the diagnosis to be as clean and binary as an X-ray of a broken bone. But maybe the language itself is trying to remind us of something vital. Isn't it profound that the exact same ancient root we use to describe the sterile scientific study of disease is also the root word we use for the human compassion required to heal it?
That is a connection definitely worth keeping in mind the next time you find yourself sitting in a doctor's office.
Keep asking questions. We will see you on the next deep dive.